You ever hear boots pacing above your head when you know there shouldn't be anyone up there? That sound doesn't just stay in your ears, it seeps into your bones. My girlfriend and I were always into urban exploring. We'd pick places most people avoided: asylums, rail tunnels, abandoned cabins. But the night we decided to sneak into the old Wicklow Lighthouse, we crossed into something we weren't prepared for. The lighthouse sat on a crumbling cliff, decommissioned since the 1950s. The stories around it were vague, something about the last keeper disappearing, or maybe falling from the lantern room during a storm. No one seemed to know for sure. It was half folklore, half local dare, which made it perfect for us. The first thing that hit me when we reached it was the smell. Damp salt and rust, but underneath, something old like wet wood sealed too long. The front door had been chained shut for years, but one of the side windows had been shattered, the frame barely holding on. We climbed in, our flashlights cutting through dust and shadows. Inside, the air was cold and stale. The spiral staircase twisted upward, narrow and uneven, disappearing into the dark. I remember the way our footsteps echoed. It felt like we were already being followed. We explored the bottom floor first. There wasn't much. Rotting furniture, water-stained walls, seaweed blown in through cracks in the stone. But then we found the door. It was halfway up the staircase, a thick iron thing with a heavy padlock across it. Stenciled letters on the wood still read "Keeper's Quarters." The lock was rusted solid, untouched for decades. That's when it started. Just as I was shining my light across the lock, we heard its slow, deliberate footsteps above us. Heavy boots on wood. One step, then another. Then the sound of pacing. I froze. My girlfriend whispered, "Did you hear that?" We both stared up at the ceiling. There was no mistaking it. Someone was walking around up there. Back and forth, heel, toe, heel, toe. But that wasn't possible. The keeper's quarters had been sealed for over 60 years. I tried to tell myself maybe it was an animal. A raccoon, maybe. But the sound was too heavy, too human. Each footfall thudded with weight, measured and patient, as if whoever or whatever it was knew we were there. My girlfriend wanted to leave right away, but curiosity got the better of me. I whispered, "We should go up, just to see." She shook her head hard, but when I started climbing, she followed close behind, gripping my jacket. The higher we went, the colder it got. My breath came out in white mist, even though it wasn't that cold outside. My flashlight beam shook as we reached the locked door again. The footsteps stopped. Silence. We stood there, straining to hear. Then suddenly, 3 loud bangs on the other side of the door, like someone had slammed their boots right against it. My girlfriend screamed, and I nearly lost my footing on the stairs. I pulled her down the steps, whispering, "Go, go, go." But halfway down, the pacing started again. Not above us this time, below. Something was on the ground floor, walking slowly, deliberately, as if waiting for us to come down. The sound of boots scraping against stone carried up the stairwell. We froze between floors, trapped. Above us was the sealed keeper's quarters, and below us, something moving. My girlfriend started crying quietly, her nails digging into my arm. I decided to risk it. We bolted down, flashlights bouncing wildly across the walls. When we hit the bottom, the footsteps stopped. The room was empty. I spun my light across every corner. Nothing, just old chairs, seaweed, dust. But the chain on the front door was rattling slightly, as if it had just been touched. That was enough. We scrambled out the broken window and didn't stop running until we were halfway down the cliff path. From the distance, the lighthouse loomed against the night sky. And then we saw it. The lantern room at the top, dark for decades, flickered with a faint yellow glow. Not steady, not like an electric bulb, but wavering, like a flame. And as we stood there staring, the beam shifted, sweeping out across the water as if guiding a ship that wasn't there. We didn't say a word on the drive home. My girlfriend didn't even want to talk about it. She told me later she kept hearing the sound of those boots in her sleep for weeks after. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe squatters somehow got inside. Maybe it was kids pulling a prank. But then I remembered the lock. Rusted shut, solid. No way anyone could have gotten through that door. The pacing we heard wasn't from the present. It felt imprinted, like the lighthouse itself was replaying something that had happened over and over. The keeper never left. He was still there, walking his rounds, long after the door was sealed. And the worst part? Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear him. That steady, measured sound of boots pacing overhead waiting for me to come back. It's one thing to see a light that shouldn't exist. It's another to realize it was meant only for you. I've been a fisherman for most of my life, and the sea is no stranger to tricks. Fog bends sound, the horizon shifts, shadows look like ships that aren't there. But what I saw one night in late October wasn't a trick. I still struggle to explain it, even to myself. I was about 6 miles offshore, alone, in a small trawler I'd inherited from my father. The water was calm, but the sky was heavy, thick with rolling clouds that erased the moon. Without the stars or my GPS dead from a battery failure, I was left with only instinct to guide me back. That's when I saw it, a sweeping beam of light cutting across the dark water. It was faint at first, but steady, rotating like the old lighthouses used to. Relief flooded me. I knew the coastline well enough to recognize where it must have been coming from. Grayson Point Lighthouse. That old structure had been guiding fishermen home for over a century before it was decommissioned years back. Locals said it was gutted, no power, no keepers, just an empty tower with its glass lantern room collecting dust. But I saw the beam clear as day, wide, strong, cutting through the fog and painting the surface of the water in pale yellow arcs. I steered toward it. The closer I got, the stranger it felt. There was no sound of waves crashing against the rocky point, no gulls, no wind, just the steady mechanical sweep of that light across the sea. I told myself maybe the Coast Guard had restored it, or maybe some preservation group had wired up a generator. Still, something about it unsettled me. The glow wasn't quite right, flickering, like fire instead of electricity. By the time I reached the cove near the point, the beam was almost blinding. I dropped anchor just offshore and stared up at the lighthouse. The structure was there, all right. Tall, weathered stone, black against the sky, and in its lantern room at the top, a flame burned, steady and golden. I killed the engine and sat in silence, listening. At first, only the lapping of the water against the hull. Then, faintly, something else. Bootsteps. The sound carried unnaturally well over the still night. Slow, measured footsteps circling high above, pacing in time with the light's rotation. I wanted to believe it was my imagination. But then, clear as anything, I heard a man's voice echo from the tower. Just 3 words, low and gravelly, carried by the wind. Keep her steady. Every hair on my body stood on end. I fired the engine back up and spun the trawler around, heart pounding. The beam caught my boat again, this time lingering on me like it was holding me in place. My eyes watered from its brightness, and I swear I saw something inside the flame, like a silhouette leaning against the glass, staring down. I didn't wait to see more. I pushed the throttle full and tore across the water until the light finally disappeared behind the fog. When I reached shore hours later, I tied up and went straight to the harbor office, still shaking. I told the night guard what I'd seen. He gave me a look like I was crazy and reminded me what I already knew. Grayson Point Lighthouse had been decommissioned in 1972. The lens was dismantled, the wiring stripped out. It was impossible for there to be a light. I pressed him, swore on my life what I'd seen. Finally, He muttered something I'll never forget. "You're not the first fisherman to say that, but you're one of the lucky ones who came back." He wouldn't explain, wouldn't say more, just told me to go home and forget it. But I couldn't. Over the weeks that followed, I started hearing things when I was alone on the water. Whispers carried on the wind. Sometimes it was the same voice I'd heard that night, telling me to hold steady. Other times it was different, soft, almost pleading. And always, when the fog was thickest, I swore I saw that faint flicker in the distance, as if the lantern was calling me back. I've avoided that stretch of coast ever since. But sometimes, on still nights, when the waves are calm and the air is damp, I catch a yellow glimmer at the corner of my eye. And I can't shake the feeling that one night, when I'm far enough out, that light will find me again. And this time, I might not make it back. You can't mistake the sound of knuckles against wood, especially when they're following you, step by step, up a staircase no one else should be on. Last spring, I took a short trip along the coast of Maine. I like history, and one of the stops on my list was the Heceta Lighthouse Museum, an old stone tower converted into a tourist attraction. They let visitors book a night's stay in the keeper's quarters. No staff after hours, just you and the lighthouse. It sounded like a unique experience, so I signed up. The woman at the desk handed me the keys and warned me that the place got cold after dark, but otherwise said I'd be alone until morning. I was excited at first. The tower stood tall against the gray water, the spiral staircase winding up to the lantern room. The air inside smelled faintly of salt, rust, and old wood. I spent most of the evening reading placards about shipwrecks the lighthouse had guided sailors away from. By 10 o'clock, I was getting tired. I decided to head up to the lantern room before turning in. The staircase was narrow, twisting, the iron railing cold under my hand. My footsteps echoed with a hollow rhythm. Clack, clack, clack. That's when I heard the first knock. It came from behind me, maybe 10 steps below. A sharp tap on the wood, distinct from my own footsteps. I stopped and turned, shining my flashlight down the center of the spiral. Nothing but darkness and the faint glint of the steps. I told myself the wood was just shifting. Old buildings make sounds. But when I continued climbing, it happened again. Knock. This time, 2 steps below where I'd just been. I froze, gripping the railing. My pulse hammered in my ears. I called out a shaky, "Hello?" My voice echoed, but no one answered. I started moving faster. The knocks followed, always 1 or 2 steps behind, never overlapping with my feet, always just after, like someone shadowing my climb, announcing every move. By the time I reached the top, I was sweating despite the chill. I shoved open the lantern room door and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. The room was circular, glass panes all around, the old lens in the center. The view of the dark ocean was endless, but I couldn't focus on it. I pressed my ear to the door. Silence. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it had to be in my head. Maybe the echoes of my boots against the stone had bounced strangely. I even laughed a little to shake off the nerves. But when I finally opened the door to head back down, the staircase was pitch black, and sitting on the very first step below me was a damp handprint. I backed into the lantern room, slamming the door again. The temperature in the room dropped so sharply, I could see my breath. Then the knocking started again, this time not on the stairs, but on the other side of the door. Slow, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. I held the handle tight, afraid it would turn. My flashlight flickered, dimming in and out. Every knock seemed to vibrate through the iron railing, up into my hands. I stayed there for what felt like an hour, crouched against the far wall, whispering to myself that morning would come soon. At some point, the knocking stopped, but I didn't dare move. When the first gray light of dawn seeped through the glass, I finally found the courage to open the door. The staircase was empty, silent. No handprint, no marks at all. I hurried down, not stopping to look around. When I reached the bottom, I nearly jumped out of my skin. The museum attendant was unlocking the front entrance. She smiled casually and asked how my night had been. My voice cracked as I told her what I'd heard, the knocking that had followed me up. I thought she'd laugh or brush it off, but instead, her face went pale. "You shouldn't have gone up there alone at night," she said quietly. "The keeper, he fell on those stairs. They say he still walks them." I didn't ask any more questions. I grabbed my bag and left without looking back. That night, at home, as I tried to sleep, I swear I heard it again. Not in the lighthouse this time. On the stairs in my own house. Knock. 2 steps behind. Sometimes a reflection isn't your own. It's someone who is never meant to leave. I was contracted last year to help restore the old Fairview Lighthouse on the coast of Rhode Island. The place had been abandoned since the 70s and was falling apart. A historical society raised funds to bring it back, and I was one of the crew assigned to clean and polish the Fresnel lens, a massive glass centerpiece in the lantern, room that once cast light for miles out at sea. I'd never worked on one before. Up close, it was overwhelming. Towering rings of curved glass, each prism bending light in strange ways. Even in daylight, the thing threw fractured rainbows across the room, making it hard to tell where one beam ended and another began. On my first morning inside the lantern room, I set up my tools and gloves. The air was thick with the smell of rust and salt, and the room was freezing, even though the sun was out. I brushed a layer of dust off the lens, watching it scatter like mist in the light. That's when I saw it. A face. Not mine, not distorted like my own reflection would be. This was different. A man's face, hollow-eyed, pressed close to the other side of the glass, staring directly at me. I flinched so hard I dropped my rag. My first thought was that someone had gotten inside the lantern room from the balcony outside. But when I spun around, the balcony was empty. Just seagulls circling the cliffs. I turned back to the lens. The face was gone. I laughed nervously to myself, chalking it up to the strange way the prisms bent the light. But as I continued working, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked up, I thought I saw movement just beyond the edge of the glass shadows, shifting where nothing should be. By late afternoon, I had convinced myself I was imagining things. Still, before leaving, I took one last look into the lens. That's when I noticed something chilling. Smudges. On the inside. Perfect, greasy handprints pressed against the inner wall of the lens where no one had been. I told myself it was residue from decades of neglect, but the prints looked too fresh. The next day, I went back with one of the other workers, a guy named Dale. I didn't mention what I'd seen. I didn't want to sound crazy. We worked in silence for a while, until Dale paused, frowning at the glass. "Did you see that?" he asked. I froze. "See what?" He pointed at a section of the lens. "Thought I saw somebody in there." He chuckled awkwardly. "Guess these things play tricks on your eyes." I wanted to believe that too, but my stomach twisted. Later that day, I was working alone again, carefully polishing the inner ring when my flashlight flickered out. The lantern room dimmed to a gray gloom, and in that silence, I heard it, the faintest scrape like a fingernail dragging across glass. I whipped my light back on. The face was there again, this time closer, pressed so tightly against the glass it seemed flattened, the eyes impossibly wide. I stumbled back, heart hammering, but when I blinked, it was gone. I packed my tools and left in a hurry. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that distorted face. I even dreamed of it standing inside the lens, trapped like an insect in amber, watching me from every angle. The following morning, I told myself I was done. I'd let someone else handle the lens. But when I arrived at the site, Dale wasn't there. No one was. The foreman told me Dale hadn't shown up. He was supposed to meet me in the lantern room. Reluctantly, I climbed the spiral staircase alone. The air grew colder with every step. When I opened the lantern room door, the first thing I saw made my blood run cold. The handprints. Dozens of them now, smeared across the inside of the glass, overlapping, frantic, as though someone had been pounding to get out. I didn't go inside. I couldn't. I shut the door and walked back down the stairs, forcing myself not to run. Dale never came back to work. They said he quit without notice, but no one I spoke to had heard from him. The restoration was eventually finished, and the lighthouse opened for tours. The lens looks pristine now, gleaming like a jewel. Tourists take photos of their warped reflections and laugh at how strange they look. But I won't go near it, because I know if I looked long enough, I'd see that face again. Not mine, not Dale's just hollow eyes staring through the glass, waiting for someone else to notice. And I can't help wondering if that's why Dale never came back. Maybe he didn't quit. Maybe he never left the lens at all. Some words aren't meant to be read, especially when the hand that wrote them never finished the sentence. I work as a historian for a small preservation group in New England. My job usually involves digging through old records, cataloging artifacts, and writing up reports for museums. Last year, we were tasked with documenting the old Cranes Point Lighthouse, a weather-beaten structure that had stood abandoned on the coast since the 1940s. The lighthouse had been left to rot, its paint stripped away by salt winds, windows smashed by storms. Inside, it smelled of mildew and sea rot, the floors soft underfoot. My assignment was to climb up to the attic beneath the lantern room and see if anything had been left behind. The attic was cramped, dust heavy in the air. Old trunks, broken furniture, coils of rope junk mostly. But in the far corner, half buried under rotting canvas, I found a small leather-bound book, a journal. The cover was brittle, but the pages inside were surprisingly well preserved. The first entry was dated 1912, written in tight, careful script. It belonged to a keeper named Elias Harrow. At first, the entries were mundane. Notes about the weather, supply shipments, the monotony of keeping the light burning. But as the days went on, the tone shifted. He began writing about visitors. It started subtly scratching at the door late at night, like nails dragging across the wood. He mentioned hearing voices outside, low and indistinct, carried by the wind. He wrote about footsteps on the stairs when no one else was assigned to the post. As the weeks passed, the entries grew more frantic. He described seeing pale figures on the rocks below, staring up at the lighthouse during storms. He swore they were sailors, drowned long ago, their mouths moving in silence as though still calling for rescue. One entry stopped me cold. He wrote, "They want me to open the door. Every night they knock harder. Every night the lantern flickers when they come. If I keep the light burning, they stay outside. If it goes out, I fear they will enter." I sat in that dusty attic, shivering despite the heat. The final entry was the most disturbing. His handwriting was shaky, hurried. "They are inside. I heard them climb the stairs. They are at my door now. The handle is turning. I must," and it ended there. The sentence broken off, ink smeared down the page. The pen was still wedged between the binding, as if he'd dropped it mid-word. I remember sitting back, heart racing, the silence of the attic suddenly oppressive. The air felt heavier, colder. For a moment, I thought I heard something a faint creak from the stairs below. I forced myself to laugh it off. Old wood settles. That's all. But the unease followed me the rest of the day. That night, in the small motel near the harbor, I spread the journal out on the desk and photographed the pages. Around midnight, as I flipped back to the unfinished entry, I heard a sound outside my window. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I froze. The motel was nearly empty, the parking lot lit by one flickering street lamp. I waited, holding my breath, praying it was nothing. Then the knocks came again, louder. I finally worked up the nerve to yank back the curtain. No one was there, just the empty lot and the dark ocean beyond. I shut the curtains tight, shoved the journal back in my bag, and tried to sleep. But it was impossible. All night, I swore I heard faint scratching at the door. The next morning, I returned the journal to the preservation office, but I couldn't bring myself to include the final entry in my official report. Something about it felt unfinished, dangerous even. A week later, I got a call from one of the interns cataloging the items. She sounded shaken. She asked if I had staged anything in the book before turning it in. When I said no, she told me something that made my stomach drop. The final entry was different. The words were the same at first, but now the sentence didn't stop midway. Someone or something had finished it. It read, "The handle is turning. I must open the door." And beneath that, in darker ink, one more line had appeared. "Now you must too." I haven't gone back to Crane's Point since. And sometimes, late at night, I hear faint knocking in the silence of my apartment. Always 3 knocks, always patient, like they're just waiting for me to answer. Some windows don't just reflect the night they watch it. When I was 16, I did a lot of stupid things to impress my friends. One of the dumbest was the night I broke into Hollows Point Lighthouse. It had been abandoned for decades, standing crooked on a cliffside like a black tooth against the ocean. The town called it cursed. My friends just called it the perfect place for a dare. The challenge was simple. Get inside, snap a photo from the lantern room at the very top, and bring it back. I was cocky enough to say yes. It was close to midnight when I made my way along the jagged path to the tower. The ocean below was restless, waves crashing against the rocks. The air smelled of brine and rot, and every gust of wind carried a hollow moan through the cracks of the lighthouse walls. As I got closer, I glanced up at the lantern room, the round glass chamber crowning the tower. For a second, I froze. There was someone standing there, a figure, perfectly still, framed by the moonlight behind the glass. I couldn't make out details, just a tall, dark silhouette. It was watching me. My first thought was that my friends were pulling a prank, that one of them had snuck ahead and was waiting for me at the top. But the figure didn't move, didn't wave or shout, just stood there. I shook it off, told myself it was a trick of the light, and pressed forward. The front door was locked with a heavy chain, but one of the windows at the base was smashed open. I slipped through, careful not to cut myself on the shards. Inside, the air was colder than outside. The floorboards were soft and damp, and the whole place smelled of mildew. My flashlight beam cut through the dust, landing on broken furniture and rusted tools scattered across the ground floor. I found the spiral staircase in the center of the tower. The iron steps were slick with moisture, and every time I shifted my weight, they groaned like they might collapse. Halfway up, I heard something above me. A faint creak, like footsteps on metal. My heart jumped, but I told myself it had to be the wind. The tower was old. It made noises. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of that figure in the window. When I finally reached the top, I pushed open the lantern room door. The glass panes were dirty, streaked with salt and grime, but the room was empty. Completely empty. I let out a nervous laugh and took a few photos with my phone, trying to ignore how shaky my hands were. The view was incredible. The black ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. That's when I noticed something odd. One of the glass panes had a smear across it. Not dust or dirt, a handprint. Large, pressed flat against the glass from the inside, as if someone had been leaning there, watching. The print was fresh. The condensation around it still dripped slowly down the glass. I backed away, pulse racing. My flashlight flickered, and in that dim moment, I caught movement behind me, just a shadow, sliding across the far wall of the lantern room. I spun around. Nothing. But then I felt it. The distinct sensation of being watched. My skin prickled, every instinct screaming at me to leave. I bolted for the door and clattered down the stairs as fast as I could, nearly slipping on the slick steps. The whole way down, I swore I heard footsteps following me, matching my pace, one flight above, never closer, but never fading. When I reached the bottom, I didn't even look back. I scrambled out through the broken window and hit the ground running. My friends were waiting near the road, laughing and shouting when they saw me sprinting out of the dark. I was pale and shaking, barely able to explain what I'd seen. When I showed them the photos, their laughter died. In every shot of the lantern room, there was a figure, not standing behind me, not in the room, but outside the glass, staring in. The same silhouette I'd seen from the ground, watching from the other side of the window. And here's the part that still chills me. The lantern room is over 70 feet above the rocks. There's no balcony, no ledge, nothing for anyone to stand on. But in every photo, the figure was there, right where the handprint had been. I never went back to Hollows Point. And sometimes, late at night, when I glance at my own bedroom window, I swear I see the same shadow staring in, waiting for me to dare it again. When the lighthouse went dark, the sea should have been silent. Instead, the night filled with screams. I've been working cargo ships along the northeast coast for nearly 20 years. The ocean has a way of humbling you. Storms come out of nowhere, equipment fails, and you learn to trust the little things that keep you safe. Chief among them, lighthouses. Their beams are a promise, a reminder that land is close and you're not lost. But one night, a few years ago, I learned what it feels like when that promise breaks. We were heading south, hauling late-season goods before the winter storms made runs impossible. It was close to midnight, calm seas, though a heavy fog had rolled in thick enough to swallow the bow just a few yards out. The crew and I had our eyes fixed on the Grindle Point Lighthouse. Its beams swept the water in rhythmic intervals, slicing through the fog and guiding us. Then it blinked out, just for a second. The beam vanished, and the fog seemed to fold in tighter, pressing against the ship. When it came back, the crew was already murmuring nervously. Lights don't just shut off. Not those old beacons. They're built for constancy. We told ourselves it was a fluke, but then it happened again. The light winked out for several long seconds, and in that darkness we heard it. Screams. Not one, not two, but dozens of voices echoing across the waves. High-pitched, agonized, overlapping. It was so sudden and so loud that some of the men dropped what they were doing. The sound seemed to come from all around, carried by the fog, impossible to pinpoint. Then the light flared back on, and the voices cut off instantly. The deck was silent except for the slap of waves against the hull. No one spoke for a long time. I finally managed to say, "Must have been gulls or seals." My voice didn't sound convincing, not even to me. No one argued, but no one believed it either. As we pressed on, the beam blinked out again, this time longer. We braced ourselves, and sure enough, the screams returned. Louder, clearer, and beneath them, something worse, a deep, ragged moan, like a ship tearing apart underwater. One of the younger crewmen clapped his hands over his ears, shouting for it to stop. Another leaned over the rail and vomited. The sound wasn't just loud, it felt physical, pressing against our chests, vibrating in our teeth. When the light came back, silence swallowed the night again. The fog began to thin, and we finally pulled into port hours later, shaken and exhausted. No one said a word about what we'd heard until the next morning. I was having coffee with the first mate when he asked if I thought it was a trick of the fog. I told him I didn't know, but he leaned in, pale and said, "I recognized one of the voices. I swear I did. It sounded like my uncle. He went down with the ship off this coast 30 years ago." I didn't know what to say. When I asked around later, 2 other men claimed the same. They said they heard voices of people they knew, relatives, friends, who had drowned at sea. Over the years, I've heard rumors about Grindle Point. Fishermen whisper that the beacon isn't reliable, that sometimes it fails without explanation, and when it does, people hear things. Screams, whispers, even their own names carried over the waves. I never went back that route again if I could help it. But sometimes when I dream, I hear those voices rising out of the dark. The sound is always the same, desperate, panicked, echoing in the fog. And the worst part is, I can't help thinking, if the light ever goes out for good, maybe the screams won't stop. Maybe they'll be waiting for us, calling until we join them. Some things the sea drags in never crawl back out, but they still reach for you. I was working as the seasonal keeper for Whitlock Lighthouse, a remote stone tower on the New England coast. My duties weren't glamorous, keeping the lantern in order, logging the weather, and clearing the slippery rocks at the base of seaweed and driftwood so supply boats could land safely. It was during one of those cleanups that I saw them. The tide was halfway out, leaving the jagged rocks slick and dark. I was crouched down, yanking strands of kelp loose when movement caught my eye. At first, I thought it was more seaweed bobbing in the current, but then I saw pale fingers. Hands. Human hands, pale and bloated, clawing at the rocks just below where I stood. I stumbled back so fast, I nearly slipped. My heart hammered as I scanned the water for a body, but there was none, just the hands, pale against the black stone, scraping upward as if desperate to climb out of the sea. I shouted, "Hold on." Before realizing how insane it was, there was nothing attached to them. No face, no torso breaking the surface, just 2 hands disappearing and reappearing as the waves lapped over them. I raced back up to the lighthouse and grabbed the binoculars, telling myself maybe the water distorted what I'd seen. But when I looked again, the hands were still there, still moving. The nails scraping against stone were faint, but I swear I heard them over the crash of waves. And then, just as suddenly, they were gone, pulled back beneath the water, leaving nothing but foam. For hours afterward, I convinced myself it had been an illusion. The seaweed can take strange shapes. Maybe I'd been tired, maybe the light had tricked me. But the next morning, I found scratches on the rock screws, shallow but unmistakable, like fingernails dragged against stone. I didn't tell anyone at first. Who would believe me? But the sight haunted me every time I went back down to clear the shoreline. My eyes always drifted to the surf, waiting to see pale fingers breaking through again. It was a week later when they returned. I was hauling driftwood when I heard it, a wet, slapping sound against the rocks. I froze. Then I saw them again. The same hands, emerging from the water, clawing desperately for purchase. This time I noticed something worse. They were closer. Not at the waterline, but higher up, as if whatever they belonged to was dragging itself further out with each visit. The skin was gray, mottled, and swollen, the nails long and splintered. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, just watched as they clawed at the stone then, after a few minutes, slipped back beneath the waves. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those hands reaching, grasping. The next day, I reported it to the harbor master when he came with supplies. He laughed nervously, said I'd been alone too long, that the sea can make a man see things. But before he left, his expression darkened. He said in a low voice, "My grandfather used to say the drowned don't rest easy here. They're still reaching." That didn't help. By the third encounter, I nearly lost my mind. It was dusk, the sky purple over the waves, when I saw the hands again. This time, they weren't scraping, they were gripping. Clutching the rock with such force, I could see the knuckles whiten. Water ran between the fingers, dripping steadily as they held fast. I ran back inside the lighthouse and locked the door. But even from up in the lantern room, I thought I saw movement at the base of the tower, shadows swaying just out of the surf, waiting. That night, the sound started. Knocks, slow, deliberate knocks against the stones of the foundation, reverberating up through the floor. At first faint, then louder, as if those hands had finally found the walls of the lighthouse itself. I sat awake until dawn, clutching the rusted service pistol left in the keeper's desk, though I doubted it would do any good. The hands didn't return the next day, or the day after. For a while, I convinced myself it was over. But when my contract ended and I left Whitlock, I walked down to the rocks one last time. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to prove to myself it wasn't real. That's when I saw the grooves again. Fresh ones. Deep, uneven scratches trailing higher up the rock than before. And the last mark stopped just beneath the edge of the supply platform, where I had been standing the very first time I saw them. I've never gone back. But sometimes, when I'm near the coast, I hear it in the crash of waves, the faint scrape of nails against stone, like they're still climbing. And one day, they'll make it all the way out. Keys don't rattle by themselves, especially not in doors you already locked. In 1986, I accepted a position as the keeper of the Harrows Reach Lighthouse, an isolated tower off the rocky coast of Maine. It was lonely work, but I liked the solitude. The only link to shore was a supply boat that came once every 2 weeks. The Coast Guard told me the previous keeper, a man named Warren, had resigned suddenly, though no one explained why. The first days were uneventful. I spent my time cleaning, logging the weather, and checking the lamp. The quarters were sparse but livable. A small bunk, a desk, a stove. The nights were the hardest long stretches of silence, broken only by waves pounding against the cliff. It was my third night when I first heard it. I was sitting in bed with a book when I caught the faint jingle of keys. At first, I thought it was part of the wind rattling something loose. But then I heard the sound of metal sliding into a lock, twisting. The door to my quarters creaked open. I shot up, heart hammering. The door swung halfway before stopping. Nobody was there. I grabbed the lantern and searched the staircase outside. Empty. I locked the door again, convinced I must not have latched it properly. But the same thing happened the next night. Just past midnight, I heard the keys again. Distinct, clear, followed by the deliberate sound of the door unlocking from the outside. The knob turned. The door inched open. I sat frozen in bed, clutching the lantern, whispering to myself that no one else was here, that the only keys to the lighthouse were the ones in my pocket. And yet the door still opened. By the fifth night, it wasn't just my quarters. I began hearing it elsewhere, a supply closet, the lower storage room, the maintenance hatch that led to the rocks below. Always the same pattern. Keys rattling, locks turning, doors opening one by one. I would run down the spiral stairs, only to find the doors ajar, swinging slightly as if someone had just walked through. I started keeping notes in my log, marking the time each sound occurred. Midnight, then 2 a.m., then again at 3:15. It was as though someone was making rounds, like another keeper tending to the lighthouse alongside me. One evening, curiosity overrode fear. I left my own door unlocked, lantern burning low, and pretended to sleep. Around midnight, the sound began again. Keys jangling, the knob twisting. My door creaked open wider this time. I squinted just enough to see into the dark. A shadow leaned into the room. Broad-shouldered, tall, unmoving. I didn't see a face, only the silhouette cast against the wall by my lantern. It lingered for what felt like minutes, breathing faintly, before pulling the door shut again. When I finally worked up the nerve to leap from bed and fling the door open, The hallway was empty. The next supply run couldn't come fast enough. When the boat finally arrived, I asked the captain about Warren, the previous keeper. He exchanged a glance with his deckhand before answering. Warren didn't resign. He disappeared. Last winter. They found the lighthouse doors all standing open, his keys missing from the ring. Place looked like he'd unlocked every room before vanishing. He paused. Funny thing is, they never found his body. Just his logbook. Last entry said something about doing the rounds one final time. That night, back in the tower, I barely slept. Every door was locked, every key on my ring checked twice. Still, just after midnight, the sound came again. The faint jingle of keys, the whisper of a lock turning, the slow creak of the door opening. Only this time, I swear I heard something else. A voice, low, rasping, carried through the crack of the door. Your shift's over. It's mine again. I haven't returned to Harrow's Reach since. Another keeper took the post after me, but I never heard what became of him. Sometimes I still wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, certain I can hear it, the rattle of keys just outside my bedroom door, waiting for me to hand over the lighthouse and everything else. It's one thing to hear your name in an empty place. It's another when the voice calling it is your own. Last summer, I visited Blackthorn Lighthouse with my cousin, Daniel. The place had been restored into a tourist attraction, but the history around it was darker than the brochures admitted. Dozens of shipwrecks had occurred just offshore, and locals whispered that the keepers had gone mad from isolation. The tower was tall and narrow, its spiral staircase winding up to the lantern room at the top. Visitors were allowed to climb it at their own pace, and Daniel and I decided to check it out one afternoon. At first, it was harmless fun. The steps were steep but sturdy, our voices echoing as we joked about the view we'd get at the top. But about halfway up, the air grew colder. The sunlight filtering through the narrow slits in the wall dimmed. The higher we climbed, the quieter the tower seemed, like the ocean outside had muted itself. And that's when I heard it. My name. Soft, whispered, drifting down from above. I stopped so suddenly that Daniel almost ran into me. Did you say something? I asked. He shook his head. His expression was serious now. No, but I thought I heard mine. We stood there, listening. And then, clear as day, it came again. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, curling down from the lantern room. Daniel? And immediately after, Mark. Hearing my own name spoken in that hushed, drawn-out voice sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the draft in the stairwell. Daniel laughed nervously. Must be people already up there, messing with us. But when we started climbing again, the whispers followed. Every few steps, the voices repeated our names, stretched thin as though the walls themselves were speaking. Daniel, Mark. The higher we went, the worse it got. The whispers overlapped, echoing at odd intervals, like two versions of ourselves were waiting above, calling us closer. Daniel muttered, I don't like this, but we kept going. It felt impossible to turn back, like the staircase itself was pulling us upward. When we finally shoved open the lantern room door, my stomach dropped. The room was empty. No visitors, no pranksters. Just dusty glass panes streaked with salt and the massive lens in the center. The air was icy, sharp enough to sting my lungs. Daniel walked to the window, scanning the horizon, while I lingered at the door, my skin prickling. That's when I heard it again. Mark. But this time it wasn't from above. It was right behind me. I spun around so fast, I nearly lost my balance. The stairwell gaped open, dark and silent. Nobody there. Did you hear that? I whispered. Daniel turned, pale. It said my name again. We locked eyes, both of us realizing at the same moment that the whispers hadn't stopped at the lantern room. They had followed us inside. Then, From the far corner of the room, the lens gave off a faint hum, like glass vibrating. We stepped closer, hesitant, and in its surface, distorted and warped, we saw our reflections. Only they weren't moving the way we were. I lifted my hand instinctively, and the reflection lifted a second later, lagging behind. Daniel swore under his breath, backing away. His reflection grinned when he didn't. The whispers swelled, circling us, filling the room with overlapping versions of our own voices, all hissing our names. I grabbed Daniel's arm. "We're leaving, now." We bolted down the stairs, taking them two at a time, the voices chasing us. Every time my foot hit a step, I heard my name breathed in my ear. I didn't look back. I couldn't. We burst out of the tower into the blinding daylight, gasping for air. The ocean roared back into sound as if it had been muted inside. Daniel and I swore never to speak of it again, but later that night, back at the hotel, I woke to the sound of whispering. At first I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it clearly. My name. "Mark." I sat up, trembling, and looked across the room. Daniel was already awake, staring at me wide-eyed. He'd heard his too. Neither of us went back to Blackthorn. But the thing is, I still hear it sometimes, in the quiet, when I'm alone. My name, whispered softly, like it's coming from the top of a staircase I can't see. And I know if I ever answer, it'll be waiting. Boot prints don't just appear out of the ocean, especially when there's no one left to wear them. In 1979, I was assigned a 6-month rotation as keeper of the Coldwater Point Lighthouse. It was an isolated post, sitting on a spit of rock half a mile out from the main coast. Supplies came by boat twice a month, but otherwise, it was just me, the gulls, and the endless churn of the Atlantic. One night in late October, a violent storm hit, the kind that rattled the whole tower, waves exploding against the foundation, so hard I thought the walls might crack. I stayed awake most of the night tending the lamp, fighting the fear that the beacon would go out just when sailors needed it most. By dawn, the storm finally eased. The air was damp and heavy, and the fog clung to the rocks below like it refused to leave. I decided to go outside and check for damage. That's when I saw them. Boot prints. They started at the shoreline, pressed deep into the wet sand, as if someone had dragged themselves out of the sea during the night. The steps were uneven, sloppy, like whoever it was had been exhausted. They led straight to the lighthouse door. My stomach dropped. I knew the door had been locked from the inside. I checked it twice during the storm. Yet the prints stopped at the threshold, and when I pushed the door open, I saw the trail continue inside. Wet boot marks tracked across the stone floor, glistening in the weak morning light. They were fresh. Too fresh. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing off the spiral staircase. No answer. I followed the prints cautiously, my pulse hammering. They wound up the stairs step after step, leaving a slick trail as if the sea still clung to whoever made them. I climbed after them, each creak of the stairs making me flinch. When I reached the keeper's quarters halfway up, I stopped. The door stood ajar, and the prints went straight inside. I swallowed hard and pushed the door open. The room was empty, bed neatly made, lantern cold, but the wet prints cut straight across the floor and back out into the stairwell. Upward, I followed, every nerve screaming for me to stop. But I couldn't. The prints climbed higher, past the service closet, past the storage level, up toward the lantern room. When I finally reached the top, the air felt colder than it should have, heavy with the smell of salt. The trail ended at the railing that circled the beacon. There were no more prints. Just a final pair pressed deep against the floorboards, facing outward, as if whoever it was had stopped to look at the ocean. And then, nothing. No return steps. No sign they'd left. I leaned over the railing, scanning the rocks below, but there was no one. Just the sea, gray and restless. I stayed frozen there for a long time, listening to the groan of the tower. Finally, I forced myself back down. The prints were already fading, drying away into faint stains on the wood. By nightfall, they were gone completely. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that exhaustion from the storm had made me see things. But a week later, it happened again. Another storm, another dawn, another trail of wet boot prints leading from the ocean to the lighthouse door. Always the same path, always stopping at the railing up top. I stopped sleeping after that. On my last week at Coldwater Point, I couldn't resist any longer. The storm that night was the worst yet. Rain hammering against the glass, thunder shaking the lamp itself. Around midnight, I heard it. Boots, not just prints this time. Footsteps, heavy and slow, climbing the stairs. Water dripped with every step, echoing in the stairwell. I sat rigid in my bunk, heart slamming, listening as the steps climbed past my door, up and up, until they reached the lantern room above. Then silence. I don't remember how long I sat awake, clutching the lantern. When dawn finally came, I forced myself upstairs. The prints were there again, soaked into the wood. They ended, as always, at the railing. But this time, the lamp was burning lower than it should have been. Its flame almost guttered out. And the wick adjuster, the tool only a keeper would use, was still warm in my hand when I touched it. Like someone had been there, tending the light before me. I left Coldwater Point when my contract ended and never went back. But sometimes I dream of that stairwell, the slow, wet steps climbing higher, the boots that never walk back down. And I can't shake the feeling that whoever first manned that tower never really left. The sea just keeps bringing him back. You? Some voices on the radio fade with static. Others keep calling, long after the station they came from is gone. I used to work nights as a radio operator for the Coast Guard. It was a lonely job, hours of silence, broken only by the occasional chatter, the hum of the transmitter, or an emergency call. One stormy night in 1994, I picked up a signal that should not have existed. It started with static, louder than usual, filling my headset with a low hiss. Then, beneath it, a voice, weak, crackling through the interference. Mayday, Lighthouse, anyone, please respond. I straightened in my chair. The coordinates in the transmission placed it near Blackwater Rock, a jagged outcropping infamous for shipwrecks. I knew the spot well. I also knew the lighthouse there had burned to the ground in 1943. I pressed my mic. This is Coast Guard Station 42. Identify yourself. What's your situation? The reply came after a burst of static. A man's voice, trembling. I can't keep the light burning. It's too dark. They're coming. Please don't leave me alone here. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I asked for his name. He didn't answer. Just repeated, "Don't leave me here." Then the signal cut, fading into static. I reported it to my supervisor, but he waved it off. Said it was probably interference bouncing off the storm. Maybe a fisherman with faulty equipment. But I knew what I heard. Over the next few nights, it came again. Always around the same time, always the same frequency. The same desperate voice calling from a place that didn't exist anymore. Sometimes the words changed. They're at the door. The fire, it's everywhere. Please, someone answer. Once, I swear I heard the sound of boots pounding on wood in the background, and faintly screams muffled, as though trapped behind walls. I started digging into records. The keeper of Blackwater Lighthouse in 1943 had been a man named Thomas Grady. He died in the fire that destroyed the tower, trapped inside when lightning struck and ignited the oil supply. His body was never recovered. Every detail matched the voice I was hearing. I stopped sleeping. I'd sit at the radio long after my shift ended, waiting, Sometimes the signal came. Sometimes it didn't. But when it did, it always carried the same plea, breaking through the static like he knew I was listening. Don't leave me alone. One night, curiosity or maybe madness got the better of me. I broke protocol. I stayed after hours and tuned the transmitter to his frequency, speaking softly into the mic. Thomas, if you can hear me, you've been gone for 50 years. For a long moment, only static. Then, in a voice warped by interference, he whispered, I know. The signal cracked, loud and violent, making me tear off my headset. When the noise settled, I heard something I'll never forget. Not words this time. Breathing. Shallow, ragged, directly in my ear. I ripped the plug from the wall. The radio went dead. I told myself that was the end of it, that I'd imagined it, or maybe fallen asleep at the console. But the next evening, when I sat down for my shift, the transmitter was already on. And the voice was waiting. Don't leave me here. This time, it didn't sound like it was coming through the radio at all. It sounded like it was right behind me. I turned, heart hammering, but the room was empty. Just me, the equipment, and the storm raging outside. I put in for a transfer the next morning. I never touched a radio again. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind picks up, I still hear it faintly. A man's voice, crackling through the static of the world itself. Please, don't leave me alone. And every time, I wonder if I answered, would it stop? Or would it finally find its way out of the signal and into me?